As you might imagine, returning an HTTP response like this is fine for a toy example like we've done, but in the long run, we want to actually render out a real HTML document. It has to be real, valid HTML to really make this thing useful. So what we can do is actually set up our templates directory. So inside of my SRC folder, I'm going to make a new folder called templates. Right. So templates meaning that I can actually put actual HTML in here. So let's go ahead and make our first one. I'm just going to call this hello_world.html. And in here, I'll just do an h1 tag and call it hello world. So with that, I actually want my homepage to render out that hello world from the template itself. So from that HTML document itself. Now to do this, we import another item from Django. So from Django.shortcuts, import render. And what render is going to do is it's going to be something very similar to this response, but instead what it's going to do is take in the request and then the actual template name. In my case, it's hello world.html. That's the name of this template. And then it's going to return it. So in a similar fashion to that return response, it's going to take in the request and combine it with the HTML document and then return things back. I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit. So now let's go back into that home page. Since I've changed that template, I get this error, template does not exist. Well, the reason for this is because we haven't actually set up Django to look for this folder here. So let's go ahead and do that. So this right here would actually be a server error, right? This is in debug mode right now. That's why we see it look like this, but this is an actual server error. So if I didn't set up my Django project or I named the template wrong, like if I wrote it wrong here and it had a different name here, let's say for instance I wrote just hello.html, that's the same error. It won't be able to find this page, right? Even if I have it set up correctly. Cool. So let's set it up and simulate that error all over again so we know what the template does not exist error means. So if we go into our settings now, so in Try Django, settings right next to URLs and views, we're going to scroll down, we're going to skip a lot of things, and we're going to look for the templates item here. So this is that templates configuration. So the directory or the path as to where these templates are is ospath.join baster and then templates. You're like, whoa, 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 where did all this come from? Well, let's actually take a look. First of all, baster is declared right here, right? So that's showing me where the root of the Django project is. That's in manage.py, right? And how I knew it was just templates because that's the name of my folder that's literally right next to manage.py. So to actually look at this, we are going to jump into the Python shell. So I'm going to close out the Django server and run python manage.py shell. And we'll go ahead and do from django.conf import settings. What this does is gives me access to this settings file here. And now I can do settings.base_dir. I hit enter. That actually shows me the path to the root of my Django project, to that base directory. That, of course, is where manage.py is. And if you want to bring them together, you can do something like this. So let's go ahead and also import OS and then copy and paste this in. And of course, I don't have baster defined. It's right here. So I'll go ahead and say baster is equal to that setting. And I'll go ahead and paste that value again. And there's that path. Now, of course, I could also just check to make sure that that's a valid path by opening up a new terminal window, copying that entire thing without the parentheses. They don't, or the quotes, you don't need them. So we cd into that and we list things out. And what do you know? That's where hello world.html is. Now, the biggest difference is the reason I don't put that direct path like that is you Windows users probably already know, is because this is not the correct path on Windows, right? So you'd use different slashes altogether. So this just means that it's relative to this project and it's based off of the operating system that I'm in. Those two things in combination with each other are how you'll actually find those templates. Cool. So now that we have that setting and we've verified some stuff, let's exit out of the Python shell and we'll run python manage.py, run server again, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at my template. And what do you know? It actually renders it out. I don't have an error. And of course, if I go back into that view and changed it to hello underscore and refresh it again, I get an error, right? It doesn't find that template because that actual template file is not inside of my templates right there, right? So of course I need that actual file. Cool. Now that I have this template, let's go ahead and bring in Bootstrap. So I'm going to go to getbootstrap.com. I'm going to go into the documentation and I'm going to scroll down to their starter template. And I'll just go ahead and copy this whole thing here and we'll paste it into our hello world. And we save that. Let's go ahead and make sure our server is still running and refreshing our homepage. Hello world looks the same. Now to make it actually look different, let's go ahead and do div class equals to container, div class equals to row, and finally div class equals to column 6 mx auto. Okay, close off these divs. No worries if you don't know Bootstrap enough to know what's going on. Just copy what I'm doing. We'll explain some resources for that later if I haven't already. So I refresh in this page and what do you know? Hello world's there. So as you see, I have a lot more code going on. It's not a whole lot different, still rendering out just hello world, but there's a lot more references and this is now a valid HTML document that's being rendered. So the next question should be, is like, how do I dynamically add stuff into this HTML document? In other words, how do I say, change this to being a different title based off of the page that I'm on, right? So like my about page, it should be a different title. My contact page should be a different title, just like we did when we were running those examples. Let's go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and jump into the Python shell to discuss something that you probably know, and that is string substitution. So if I said something like ABC equals to this is awesome, and then I wanted to actually substitute awesome with a different item, we can use, the format method. So dot format and then say awesome. And we would go into ABC. You could also do it where it's a variable name. So we would say another, and then the format would be another equals to awesome, right? So this string substitution, this same concept works with Django templates. So let's go ahead and exit out of this shell, and I'm going to run the server again. So now what I can do is pass in a dictionary here with some context. So let's say, for instance, I want to pass in the context variable of title. So I'm going to say title equals to hello there, ... Okay. So I want to pass this in and I want my HTML document to use it. Now with that string substitution, we could just say doc equals to, h1 and then title h1 and then dot format title equals to title, right? And then that document would actually render out the correct HTML. So Django templates, or the Django templating engine, is not a whole lot different than that, but the syntax is slightly different. So Django rendered doc equals to almost the same thing, but instead of one curly bracket, you use two curly brackets. And in fact, you use that inside of the template itself. So then all we do is pass in the title being the title. Of course, we want to have a valid dictionary here. So this is actually what's being passed. And these are arbitrary, just like they are with the string substitution in Python, right? So arbitrary variables here. So my title, just so we don't get anything too confused here, I'm going to go ahead and delete these, or I'll just comment them out as reference. So again, remember those double curly brackets. Now what we want to do is jump into our HTML document and replace this part right here with title. We save that, refresh in here, we get titles not defined. Oh, it's possible that I made a mistake. So let's go ahead and save in here. We need to make sure that everything is defined and saved. I refresh. I'm getting a doc error. Yeah, oh, it's trying to format these comments. Not exactly sure why, but let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I got rid of those comments, and now I refresh, or I updated those comments rather, and now I refresh, and what do you know? Hey, hello there is working. Cool. So that means that also my About and Contact page can do something very similar. So let's do that. And this time I'm just going to go ahead and pass the title here, About Us, and also pass it down here, Contact Us. Okay, so now what I've done is rendered context inside of a Django template. That's what it's called. So if we go to About, it says About Us still, or if I change it just to About, About. And of course it's actually using the same HTML. So if I inspect that element there, I see that all of that HTML is exactly the same on Hello World. Now I think that's pretty cool. It makes it really easy to render out some of our own content inside of this template itself in a way that I think is also pretty familiar for a lot of you who know Python. There's this concept in web development and software development called don't repeat yourself. And it stands for, dry. You'll see that over and over again when you start to build things. Now, what we want to do is make sure that we're not being too repetitive with a lot of our content. And further, like my content right now, well, perhaps I want more than just a title in any given page, right? So perhaps I want an actual template for my About page. So to do that, I would come in here and say about.html, and then I would copy literally all of that document, and then I would put in some more relative, this is about us sort of text, right? So now my About page has some more content, and it's different content than my home page or my index page, right? But I violated dry. Right, so back into that view, I just violated that statement. How did I do that? Well, if we look in Hello World, we see that I've got all of this stuff here, including the title, including the head. I've got a lot of things in here that are repetitive, not just on Hello World, but also on About. So we want to get rid of that repetitiveness. Luckily, Django has something built in for this inside of templates. So we go back into our templates, we're going to make another new file, and we're going to call this base.html. Now this is convention. Calling it base.html is convention. So that means that you can call it whatever you'd like, but most people call it base.html. And what this is like the parent of all of my HTML documents. What that means is I'm going to go ahead and copy hello world.html and paste it in here. Right, so when I say the parent, what I mean is I want to have all of the valid HTML stuff on all of my templates. Every single template, I want to make sure that it has those things. Right, and I also probably want to make sure it has my actual title and perhaps some brand and maybe a nav bar and stuff like that. Like I want to keep things consistent across my project, and having my base.html will allow that to happen. So what I can actually do is I can go into any Django HTML document and I can delete everything and just literally say extends base.html. Right? So you got curly brackets, %, extends. Extends is crucial. And then quote base.html. Now base.html again is an arbitrary name, but it is convention. So if I save this on about as well as hello world, I can now render out something in this base document. So let's go ahead and look at it. I render out about. It's still rendering that context variable, except my other part went away. And then hello world, or hello there. Both of those things are still working. Great. But my paragraph went away. So that paragraph of like, this is more about stuff went away, right? So in my about, if I add that in, what the heck? It's not rendering. And that's because we don't have a way to then render it inside of this template. Right? So it's rendering out those context variables, as in the curly bracket one, that are declared in the view, but also declared inside of that template, right? So what I need to do is add another block, which is not too dissimilar to this. That other block is called a block, right? So we open the block and we end the block. So I'm going to replace this block. I'm going to replace this value with some other value. Now, as you might imagine, if I need to replace multiple values, well, how am I going to do that when I write block, it's the same name over and over? Like, how do I reference this block versus this block? Well, I actually just give it a name. So these are also arbitrary, but convention. Sometimes you see title, sometimes you see head title. Okay, so the blocks themselves, still curly brackets, %. So the block and then the name. So what these blocks do is allow me to replace values inside of it. You can have them empty or actually have some sort of value. Right? So I save that, and if I refresh on about, it says replace this value. And it also says it on the title up there. So back into my about.html, I can replace those values using that block again, and then the content itself. And then we called one block content, and the other one we called head title. So block content, whenever you open it, you must close it. And I think the reason for the opening and closing is rather intuitive, right? So I want to make sure that I'm replacing whatever that block is with what's inside of it. So I definitely need it opened and closed for that reason. And now I can say just about us, and I refresh. What do you know? This changes, and so does this. So this is called template inheritance. This is the main parent document, and then every replacement is being done by the child element, right? So it looks for that main document, and then it looks for individual blocks in there that can actually render out and change. And not to worry, you can still use those context variables, and you can use them as many times as you need, right? So those are still coming in. You just need to make sure that whenever you need to replace content, you put it inside of one of these blocks. Now, these blocks can render out to any kind of content. So if you had JavaScript and you wanted to put that into a block, you totally can. It just replaces what's on that HTML document, and it all does that because of this function. So this function is handling all of that for us, right? If I tried to do this same thing with HTTP response, it would not work. So it handles all this, and it allows for much more dynamic templates. Now, if this isn't fully sticking yet, try it a bunch yourself. We're going to do a lot more with these things. These are fundamental to a Django project, is having these templates working. Before we move on from this concept, I want to say that you don't only have to render out HTML. You can render out other kinds of things for this template engine. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I mean by that. And I'm still going to render out HTML, but you can try it with a different data type, like a TXT or something like that. So I'm going to just change this contact page to example page. And what I want to do here is return the HTTP response, and I want to return the render data. Okay, so I want to return something here. And that's going to be a string. So that something here is going to be equal to the result of a template. So in our case, we'll stick with hello world and also some context. So the context or the things that will be rendered, I'll leave in as what we've been using. And this time I'll just say example. Okay. So I want to turn this something here into actual rendered template and return it as a response. We'll get rid of some of these comments here. And let's go ahead and import this example page into our URLs. Okay, and then I will put this down above the contact page, and we'll just call it example. Okay, and let's go ahead and look. If we go into example, it renders out the string of hello world. No surprise here, right? Because we didn't actually do anything other than set it as a string. So how do I actually turn this into a template? Well, let's go ahead and change something here to template name and the context. These are now better suited for long-term development because these are convention. And what I'll also do is go from Django.template.loader. We're going to import the getTemplate method. This getTemplate method then is going to go ahead and say template object is equal to getTemplate, and that's going to be of this template name, so whatever that is. And then our HTTP response is going to be template object.render, and then that context that we had here. We save that, we refresh in here, and what do you know? It actually allows me to send this data in as I need. That is pretty cool. So this is roughly doing the same thing as this, but it's not quite there. Now, I just want to show you this because it's a good idea, because every once in a while you might have a TXT or a string of some kind that you want rendered. So I'll go ahead and do the last thing of rendered item. And this is not necessarily going to be convention here, neither is template object, but the idea here now is this is actually a rendered string. So I can take this same concept and use it inside of any of my pages. Let's go ahead and say that this is my title.txt, and we come in here and say title, and that's it, right? So it's not super complicated here, but now what I can do is leave my title in, say context equals to this dictionary here. And I'm going to go ahead and still pass that title as something different. This is very redundant, but I wanted to show you the example. So the template name this time is now title.txt. So we can grab that, the rendered item or the rendered string in this case, is going to render out hopefully something that we want to see. So we bring this down here and turn it into rendered string. And let's go back into our home page, and it's still saying hello there. And I can print out that rendered string as well. So we refresh and look at our terminal, and there it is. It's printed out inside of our terminal. Okay. So naturally, this is a lot of redundant information, but if my title.txt had, some other data here that we really needed to render out, you could do that there as well. So yeah, I don't think what I just showed you is super practical, this part at least, but understanding how we can render templates in other contexts is absolutely, absolutely practical. One other aspect about the Django templating engine that's really nice, and it's not necessarily how things are being rendered, but what can be rendered. So I'm going to simplify this homepage again and literally just use this context here. I don't need any of that old stuff, so I'll just leave it like this. And let's go ahead and take a look at it. Got my server running, and I refresh in here. Of course, it's not actually showing anything, so let's make some modifications. I'm not going to use hello world anymore. Now I'm going to go ahead and use home.html. So let's make a new file for that, home.html. The process, of course, is these curly brackets with % and extends base.html. And then we add in a block content, so block content. And that, of course, is because our base.html has it. And then we do in block. Okay. So again, we can have our title come in. Another thing that I can add is our user. So I can literally put user here. And I can also do user dot is authenticated. And before I check that, of course, I'm going to save everything. I can go to my view and see that I did not pass that in as my context. Right? It's just coming through. So that means that here I can refresh, and what do you know? It shows me my username and true. And of course, if you weren't actually logged in, like I'm not in my incognito, it shows me anonymous user and false, right? Pretty cool. So this is because of Django's context variables. You can look at them inside of our settings, and those context variables are coming from the context processors. It's coming from these things right here, right? So one of them is the auth. Another thing by default that comes through is the request. So in my template again, I can also do, well, I can use request.user, which will give me the same value as that. And I can also use request.path, and we can refresh. And what do you know? It's showing me that same information that's related to this. That's pretty cool. So those are Django context processors. They're added by default. So on our views, we don't have to re-reference them. And this is something that's like used over and over again so that we can stay nice and dry and not have to add in our user into context every single time, right? That's pretty cool, as well as our request. So we've talked about the very basic template tags. This is a template tag, this is a template tag, this is a template tag. We can do other kinds of template tags if we want, right? So there's a condition. So if user.is authenticated, and then we can actually execute code in there. So if the user is authenticated, then we can say, you know, user only data or specific data for that user, which we'll get into later. But for now, user only data is pretty nice because that means that if I go to my incognito window, I only see this. Rather, if I go to my user that's logged in, I see all that. And of course, they're logged in through the admin if you're not clear on that one. So another thing we can do is loop through things. So in this home page, I'm going to add a list, and I'll just call it my list. And this list will just be very simple. It's just going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is now a context variable. So inside of home.html, I can loop through that context variable, again, using the block. In this case, it's 4, and then some arbitrary variable here. So for A in my list, and then whatever you open, you must close. And then in this case, I can just do a list element and literally render out the variable A. All right, so this loops through all that stuff, and it's only going to loop through if the user is authenticated. Right, so here it is, and here it's not. Right? Okay, cool. So that's a few of the built-in template tags and filters. There's a lot more. Right? I'm not going to go through all of them. There's a lot on the Django docs that you can kind of play around with yourself. I did the if statement. I did the for loop. Now, I will say that every once in a while, you're going to want to have something like this in your templates. But most of the time, you're going to want to do that conditional logic in here. In other words, I would say something like if request.user.is authenticated, then this is what the context will be. Otherwise, the context will just be this. Right? So this is where you're going to want to put that kind of logic. And then that way in here, it will only run this loop. Right? So I get rid of all this. It's only going to run this loop if there's values to it. Right? So coming back in here and refresh, there's that stuff coming through. Whereas on my incognito window, it's not there, right? The title did change because I changed that context, but it's not going to loop through if there's no value. And therefore, in your actual views, this is where you're going to want to handle that sort of logic, right? So whether it's a list or any other sorts of elements, you're going to want to think of it in here. But this comes with time. Like after you practice it a good amount, then you'll start to get a better understanding of when to use what. So my argument would be use what works, get it working, and then start to refine how it's actually working. But it also helps by going through the Django documentation for these built-in template variables and actually playing around with them